There will be other lips that I may use, but they won't thrill me like yours used to do. Yes, I may dream a million dreams, but how can they come true? Well, there will never ever be another you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics in the Pub. We had a little bit of a hiatus. Hi, come in. But we've resumed. It's so good to see you again, and if you're new, welcome. It's really, really nice to meet you. My name is Christian Murray, and together with Robert Doles, we run the Fremantle Network. We do these events more or less every month on topics that are important to you. So if you think of a topic that you'd like us to address, let us know, and we'll do our best to make it happen, okay? Now, in a moment, I'm going to introduce our MC, who's going to be introducing our topic. But first, I want to acknowledge the fantastic staff at the local hotel. Can we have a round of applause for the staff of the hotel? Thank you. And of course, the First Nations people of Wajak Normani. I'm getting tongue-tied. Let me start again. I'd like to also acknowledge the original custodians of Wajak Noongar people and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Now, we were thinking about what to do for our topic, and we're quite excited with this one. It's a little bit technical, and I was thinking who would be a good MC? Who is somebody who can bring a little bit of levity? And not too long ago, I actually made friends with a new gentleman in Fremantle, and I really, really like him. His name is Joseph Andin. So I'm going to read what Joseph sent me, and then I'm going to tell you what I actually think of him. So Joseph is a qualified mechanical engineer, but now works more in community and creative areas. He regularly volunteers at an organisation that delivers a multi-million-dollar annual arts festival, Blazing Swan. So he's one of the bosses of Blazing Swan, or previously, including serving a term as chair. He is an event manager that has created and delivered public events at Yegan Square, Crown Convention Centre, and for the City of Fremantle. He is currently developing workshops for facilitating collective strategic planning. Now, here's why I like him. You hear stories about Steve Jobs and Wozniak, or Paul McCartney and John Lennon. There's always somebody that comes up with an idea and somebody else that implements it. If you were to have a Venn diagram between those two different people, you would have a character like Joseph. From the moment that I've met him, he's been coming up with ideas and saying, hey, this would be cool. And then I see him a few months later and he's actually doing the idea. And this is the kind of behavior, the kind of attitude that I think we really ought to encourage. And so I hope we can all encourage Joseph and people like Joseph moving forward in Fremantle. Please welcome Joseph Andin.
Good God, what an introduction. My gosh, thank you, Christian. So much love to you. So I'm going to actually quickly ad-lib on the start for this. I have been working on another concept, and I actually reached out to Christian because I know he's a fantastic facilitator and speaker, and I asked him if he would help me on this concept. And it was today at 4 o'clock or 3:30, I believe, and I failed at delivering this concept and didn't even let Christian know, and Christian made it along and he was the only person there trying to get it going. So I really just want to give such a huge shout out to Christian for his endlessly enthusiastic, positive, contagious energy. And I'm really pleased to be invited to come and facilitate in this position. So thank you so much, Christian. Thank you for the work that you do around Fremantle, here with Politics in the Pub with Rob, and the things that you do around the city of Perth for your communities. Really appreciate it. So, yeah. So tonight, at this edition of Politics in the Pub, we are here to talk about the 2026 budget, the wins, the wobbles, and what's coming up next. I've been quite lucky to be able to sit at the table with some of the speakers and just try to say as little as I possibly could, and hearing that they have a huge wealth of knowledge to be able to contribute to this topic and give us some more insight. I think probably the nicest thing about tonight's opportunity is for us to be able to see past some of the media headlines and hopefully leave here with a higher understanding of what this budget is doing and how it impacts us as a nation. Will it create more equality? Will it create more opportunity? Will it improve our communities and our housing situations and all of those other buzz headlines? Now, this could be showing my age, but I feel like that this budget has been the most violently attacked budget of any budget in my memory. Maybe it's just because I'm paying attention, maybe it's because I'm more invested in the country at present, but it seems like there's a lot going on. And every time I turn on the news, there's something else that's quite clickbaity, aggressive, wild, from Dave Hughes having rants on as many platforms as he possibly can, to Pauline Hanson starting up a new campaign called Fire the Liar. It's quite wild out there. People seem to really be losing it in response to the budget. So hopefully we see through that tonight. Tonight we have, in the news we also hear things about property owners becoming nervous, more opportunities perhaps for young people, but I've also heard that, despite the prosperity that we have, sometimes our prosperity and our linking of that to equality and accessibility to housing and homelessness issues aren't all correlated in the way that we'd like them to be. The big issues on the budget are the capital gains tax changes, negative gearing, and NDIS spending growth. So our questions tonight are, did the government get this balance right with this next budget in the best interest of Australians? Tonight's panellists are experts in politics, social policy, and in disability areas. And we're going to be looking into the Fairer Australia, housing, NDIS impacts, and whether the reforms in this budget were necessary or whether we're just shifting burdens around. Hopefully we all leave here tonight with a higher understanding of what this budget is beyond the media headlines. And in just a moment I'd like to introduce our first speaker, but first Rob would like to come up and give us an even more fun, warm welcome with Budget Goers Speed Dating.
I'm a little bit nervous. This is the first time I've ever been speed dating, but you are really gorgeous, and I really want to try and explain a few things about myself. And so I'm going to tell you 3 things about myself, things that I've been doing, so you get a bit of an idea of how wonderful I am. My name is Rob, but everyone calls me Budget because I'm really good with money. So that's my sort of nickname that everyone uses. So the first thing is that I had this experience with a few friends from work, and we all liked going to a really good pub and watching the football. Now these guys have really weird names. One of them's called Negative Gearing, and we all call him Neggy. And the other one's called Capital Gains Discount, we call him Cappy. And the other one's called Discretionary Trust, and we call him Trusty. And it was going all right for a while, but then I started realising that they're bloody ripping me off. They're not paying their fair share. So I thought, what am I going to do about this? So the worst one of all was Trusty, because he used to bring his little kids along, and when they came along, they hardly paid anything. So it was really unfair what they were doing. So I said to them, you've got to pay your fair share, but I can't do it. They got really angry and they shoved some money down on the table, and I'm bloody glad I stood up to them. So what do you think? You're nodding your head? Yeah, well, I'm glad. Good. The second thing I want to tell you about is this. My tax accountant said that, look, you've got to start giving quite a bit of money away because it'll bring your tax down, and it's a good tax deduction. So I had this special account that I opened up for this, and just a few weeks ago, bank manager sent me a very terse email. You're getting into the red in this account. So I had a good look at it, and it was pretty obvious what was happening. The donations I was giving to disability support were going up and up and up, and I think they were really ripping me off. I don't know what was going on there, but I said to them, look, I can't give you this much anymore. I'm going to cut what I'm giving to you by 50%. Some of the stuff they were doing, like giving support workers, paying support workers to take them on excursions and things like that. So anyway, they weren't very happy, but I had to, I've got to balance the account. What do you think? No, you're not very happy. I don't care. Your problem, I had to balance my account. The last thing, I've developed this really good business, and I'm really proud of myself. I read that if you eat this special diet, you can get your burps and farts and turn them, put them into bottles, and really high quality gas. and sell them overseas for big money, you know. And I was starting to make a shitload of money on this, and all very fine, I'm doing great things for my country, but these bloody greedies and trade unionists and bleeding hearts started saying, you've got to pay tax on this. I thought, 25% you've got to pay on this, and they were campaigning like fury. And I said, bugger you, I am doing great things for my country. I'm an entrepreneur. Hell, I'm a really good community person. I sponsor a major football club. I sponsor the little kids doing their life-saving. They rob burps and farts on their little life-saving. And anyway, luckily I have a couple of really good friends, very wealthy. They had a word to the Prime Minister, and that was the end of this stupid talk about any 25% tax on my gas exports. So what do you think? Oh shit, she's giving me the middle finger and she's walking off. Bloody hell, hey, you weren't very good looking anyway. But I think there's a lot more people here tonight that I can talk to, so I'll hand over to the MC and let's get the show going. Thanks, Rob.
Sounds like a very well-connected man with relationships with Neggy, Trusty and Cappy. So got the inside job there. I'm not sure how that was speed dating though. I think I might be doing speed dating wrong. That's not a problem. All right, so it's now my pleasure to introduce to you our very first speaker for this evening, who is Martin Drum. Professor Drum is the Executive Dean for the Faculty of Arts, Science, Law and Business, and Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Notre in Australia. Having participated in a range of Commonwealth and WA parliamentary government inquiries, and he's regularly sought for his insight into all things politics. Martin can provide insight into the thinking behind the political decisions that influence our lives. So, welcoming up Martin Drum.
Thanks, Joe. Robert, you don't need me to explain the budget now. You've already done it. I can sit down and enjoy my beer. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the politics behind the budget, unpack that a little bit, talk about some of its key items, particularly the politics behind the negative gearing piece and the capital gains discount piece, talk about how it's been received a little bit, and perhaps a little bit of backdown from the government as well around that. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So what is the backdrop to this budget? Effectively, in the election last year, it's only a year ago, May last year, the Labor Party really cleaned up. They got 94 seats out of 150. The Libs are in utter mess. And it's just got worse from the sense. The election, changed leaders, nothing's changed. Losing seats, not winning seats, like Farah. And I think there was a lot of people in government saw this as an opportunity to do something a bit differently, perhaps a bit more bold than they would otherwise do. And that whole idea started when Treasurer Jim Chalmers had a big tax summit, and he canvassed all these different ideas. So I'll come back to that one. The second part was the makeup of the Senate, where the government could, with Green support, pass legislation without having to get other MPs on board, which is another important consideration. And in fact, we've seen that with the negative gearing legislation recently. So that was a second fillet for the government. The third thing though, and this has been the complex thing we're all trying to kind of unpack and understand, this is this surge in One Nation support. So most of the polls have the One Nation party at around about 30-31%, which is, for followers of One Nation, fairly astronomical. Way higher than we've seen them poll at any national poll. Their best election was 1998, and even that didn't come close. They have had some good efforts in Queensland, but this is new territory for them. What that's done is train people's minds on what's underpinned this surge. And lots of different people have tried to understand this, and you've got, your Costa Morrises have done polling on this, and it seems that there's a lot of things like this: dissatisfaction with what the government's delivering, frustration with the lack of services, frustration with housing affordability in particular, linking, and then the last bit, which is where the One Nation bit comes in, linking this to massive aggression. So here's a group of people we can blame for all these problems we're experiencing. In fact, I think if you took out that last bit, you'd find a lot of other people in the room that would probably agree with some of those things. It's just the immigration part, which segues nicely into something Pauline has been talking about for many, many years, of course. So she's got the answer, she says, to our problems. So that's the second part. If I just unpack that first bit there, dissatisfaction with what government's delivering and the frustration around outcomes, I think that also feeds into the logic behind the budget as well. So how can we change up the narrative and change up the way we go about things? The last bit there, and I think this is important, is a sense that younger people don't have the same opportunities that older people have. And as someone who works in the university, I think that's a really acute issue. And we hear this from students all the time. Our students probably many of them working close to full time while they're studying full time, and still feeling like they've got no ability to save very effectively. Certainly not for a house, at least. And particularly around housing affordability, there's this massive gap between perhaps the opportunities that previously people had. And we have a situation now where the tax system has actively rewarded older people with wealth and assets. And younger people, in particular, have missed out. And the initial narrative for the government when they brought in these reforms was intergenerational change. Actually, I think they walked that back a little bit, and I'll explain why. The last bit there is the government's budget is well and truly in the red, as my good friend Rob has pointed out. So there's not a lot of money to go around, and the government doesn't really have the option to spend its way out of the problems. So it has to do things differently, perhaps on the tax side. So that's the backdrop, I think, for some of these measures which have come in, and perhaps why we did see significant reform in this budget, and why it's been so contentious and divisive. Around the cost of, there were some giveaways. There's $250 of working tax offset, tax reductions coming in from 1 July, so you'd be taxed a bit less. There's even a $1,000 instant asset write-off, so you don't need a receipt for your first $1,000 of tax deductions and things like this. They really just scratch the surface. They're not really game changers. In fact, one thing I'm a bit cynical about is when you try to give away small amounts of money to a lot of people, you don't materially change their circumstances, and all you do is cost the government money. I'm just not that excited by the $100 in fuel discount the state government gave us either. It's not that it's a bad thing, it's that it doesn't really change anything. It costs the government money, it doesn't really change anything. In fact, in that particular measure, the only people that can do it are the people that get the app working, they've got their driver's license, they know how to use the systems. Arguably, the people that probably do need that $100 are probably not going to apply for it. So here we are. I'm sure Mark might talk a bit more about those sorts of things, but often those measures are not helping people that need it. I will leave the NDIS reform, and I think Kat's going to probably unpack some of that. But it does go to that point that perhaps Rob will talk about in the budget balancing. I'm going to focus a bit more on the negative gearing and the capital gains tax. Effectively, negative gearing has helped to drive investment in the property market. Now, if that property market had been stagnant for a long period of time, and we desperately needed such investment, perhaps that might make sense. But we all know that the property market has been overheated, and has been overheated for more than 2 decades on the whole. And it flattened out in the mid-teens about a decade ago, but on the whole, it's grown enormously, and particularly in the last 3 years, it's continued to grow. Why do we think the Reserve Bank keeps raising interest rates? To take heat out of the market. So this is what the government is, it's got multiple reasons for doing this. One is to take heat out of the investors market, but also to try to increase housing affordability in the long run. I believe it will do so, but I do think the problem with trying to explain this is it's one measure amongst several that impact on housing prices. The other problem they've got, and this is where they're into trouble, they can't really accurately communicate what they want to happen with housing, right? When government ministers have been asked, what do you want to happen in the market? They and and they bumble and, oh well, maybe stay the same. Actually, what they are trying to do is perhaps create a situation where there is small incremental rises in the housing market that perhaps are outstripped by wage rises to gradually make housing more affordable. But it's a fine line. It's impacted by monetary policy, that being the Reserve Bank's policy on interest rates, and it's impacted by a whole range of other things, such as how many homes you manage to get built. Right? So you're trying to, it's a bit like, who remembers the franking policy that Bill Shorten came up with, right? Dog's breakfast. It wasn't actually a bad idea, but they could not communicate it, right? So the government is trying to take some heat out of the market, make it a bit more affordable for people who are not in that market, and try to drive change. But they're struggling with their communication piece. They are not abolishing negative gearing for existing negative gearing properties, and they are still permitting negative gearing for new properties. So actually, the policy should still drive investment in new housing, which is actually where investment's probably needed. So there's some good rationale there, but like I said, the communication piece is somewhat missing. On capital gains tax, this is a reversal back to an inflation-based capital gains tax growth that was pursued under the Keating government. Again, it makes sense in individual context, but it's A, being difficult to explain, and B, being beset by all sorts of individual situations that the government's trying to explain and address. The first of those is startups and entrepreneurs. Every startup and entrepreneur needs to invest a lot of money, sometimes with little to no chance of success. They're taking a big risk, and the price of assets does affect that risk. So they've pointed out that this is difficult for them. So what does the government do? It backtracks and accommodates entrepreneurs and startups. Others have said there's small businesses that are taking bigger risks than bigger businesses, so they backtrack and change the threshold from $2 million to $10 million turnover. All of these things are, again, messy and bumpy rides for the government when they're trying to explain complex tax changes. So you've got ideas which are sound in their rationale, but have been difficult for the government to communicate very effectively. And I think that goes to the heart of where the challenge here is. You not only need to enact good policy, but you need to communicate it effectively. And the final part there is there's always winners and losers in reform, and you can be sure that the losers bark louder than the winners. Right? So who are the winners? They're young people who don't have assets. That young people have never been good or never been really keen to explain their investment opportunities in the public arena. Older people are, they will tell you. And with the franking credits, okay? The people in the property industry have been claiming all sorts of things. People who might be benefiting from this are still trying to come to terms with it and understand that. So losers, often in public policy reform, are very loud, and that does affect how you sell reform as well. So I think that's the other problem that they've got, essentially, in terms of the politics of the budget. They have had a success in passing the negative gearing reforms, and that is a major step forward for them. And there is some green shoots for the government in terms of how that's been received the latest polling, there's 2 pollings that came out that showed a slight bump for the government then. Will that continue? Will they be able to get past that? Or will it be a bit like the Abbott government in 2014, who was beset by their first budget and then never really recovered? They also promised everyone they wouldn't touch negative gearing, and now they have. And that's always an issue that they have to get past. So there's a few things there politically that really do affect how the government's seen and how they've been able to sell this. The opposition, I would say, has been largely ineffective in countering this, mainly because they're beset by their own problems and they're being attacked from the rear from One Nation. So they're still trying to ward off the One Nation vote, and they haven't really been able to tear strips off the government. Thank you, Christian. I'll look to wind up there. I've had my say, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on how the budget's been received and how the future fortunes of the government are going forward. Happy to talk that through.
Great job.
Thank you very much, Martin. Before moving on to our next speaker, I realise I missed one of the formalities, which is to talk about the format for the night for anyone who's new here. So we've got 3 speakers who are going to be speaking tonight. They're speaking for between 5 and 10 minutes. Christian will be giving them the ding, as you have heard, when they've reached their time limit. You're welcome to go grab a beer at any time if you would like to, but know that after our 3rd speaker, we will have a time for intermission where everybody can chat, we can talk about the things that we've heard, and then afterwards the speakers will come back and we'll have a panel for where everybody can ask some questions. So that any questions that you'd like to prepare for Martin, save them in your head now. One of the questions I would be curious to ask Martin is based on the government's maybe not communicating the budget or educating us about the budget effectively enough, and I'm curious about whether journalists and media should actually be doing more on that front, but that's maybe a question we'll come to. So with that, I would now like to introduce our second speaker for the evening, who is Kat Johns. Kat is the CEO of People with Disabilities WA. Disabled People's Organisation, which is a disabled people's organisation which provides advocacy, organisation and peak body. She is the lead advocate and autistic community member and has been campaigning against the NDIS cuts in the federal budgets. Thank you, Kat.
So yeah, I know I've only got like 5 to 10 minutes, but I just needed to set the scene a little bit just to get into this. So it was like the dreaded speech. I don't mean my speech that I'm about to do. There was one back in April. I think it was April the 22nd. And it was actually a really quiet day, and I don't get many of those, as you can imagine, like, advocacy organisations. We're busy all the time, every day. There's always something coming up. So I was starting to think about, okay, maybe I could sort of take some leave or something, which is something I don't get to do very often. And then I heard from our systemic advocate who contacted me and said, oh, have you heard Mark Butler's, about to do a speech on the NDIS? And so I sort of knew this was coming, and we'd been anticipating that there would be some changes, but we'd already had the Thriving Kids, and so we're expecting there was going to be something that might be kind of manageable, we can lobby against it, but we may be able to absorb this into, community. And so anyway, then we kind of sat and watched this, and then it was like, oh, okay, this is something that is way, way over and above what we're expecting. And I think I remember it just kind of like, really kind of hitting home when a journalist said, so are people going to be removed, and so how many? And he was like, yeah, about 160,000. That's, now turned into more like 300,000, that are going to be removed or diverted. So, and then I was like, okay, well, I think my holiday, or lack of holiday, may be to Canberra, not Canterbury. Not that I was ever going to go to Canterbury anyway. I think I was more heading to Hull, which is my town that I grew up in the UK. So actually, I've never been to Canterbury. It sounds quite nice. I did go and see a version of the Canterbury Tales the other day, actually, and I was like, this journey feels a bit similar, so I can see why that came into my head. So yeah, it's brutal budget for disabled people. So basically the NDIS, obviously, this is a lot more than just about money. I mean, I know all these things are, negative hearing, everything else, it's more than stuff, but we're really talking about frontline cuts to 300,000 people with nothing really in place. So, there was some talk, I think, from Mark Butler about they're going to put foundational supports in. This has been talked about for a long time. It's largely seen as a bit of a unicorn, as in, it's never really going to exist. And so far, there's really no kind of movement on that, really, other than, the states talk to the Commonwealth and they argue. And then I think there's been a website that's going to be set up for, Thriving Kids. And that's pretty much it, really. So we're still kind of hoping that something may happen that might sort of absorb some of the need that disabled people are going to have, when they're removed from the scheme, but we haven't really seen that yet. So this is a big problem. So basically the growth cap was apparently sort of increasing at 20%. Now, I think this is complex because I used to be a commissioner by trade, and when you set up a new program, you do often have a kind of initial uptick of a scheme. I do think the government, to be fair, have done a fair bit of analytics that they would call gold standard. I agree with that, but the thing is that they sort of left it there, and this is complex from an analytical point of view, but when you use a sort of certain set of data to make assumptions, some of those are correct. I think some of their concerns were around if we've got people on the scheme and someone goes into the scheme when they're really young, 6 or 7 years old, then they're going to be on that scheme for the rest of their life. And so therefore, there is some of their data was kind of okay, but they didn't make sort of adjustments to it, which is what you're supposed to then do, right? So I'm not an analyst by trade, but I know enough about analytics to know that once you've got your gold standard, you then look at what adjustments you need to make. That didn't really happen. So I'm very much unconvinced by the trajectory prediction of the scheme. I did put together a little web app actually where you can make a plan, you can make a plan in 10 minutes, like a commissioning plan to reduce inefficiencies, which I think is much better. I'd say that pretty much anyone in Fremantle anyway really could probably make a more convincing plan than the one we have. So I'll talk a little bit about what that plan is. So the growth cap now they're looking at is getting that down to 8%, and they're looking at sort of savings of $17.3 billion and the removal of 300,000 people using a system which people are comparing to robo-debt. So basically an automated system to reassess everyone, and then I can imagine it's a little bit like I do remember actually commissioning something called NHS 111 in the UK and in northwest London, and obviously you'd have this thing where you'd have a process where this is about ED diversions basically. So you kind of call up and somebody says, okay, so we're going to go through a system where we kind of check whether you need to go to the ED or whether we can just go to your doctors or whatever. Of course, I was at the point where this hadn't been working. Everybody was just being sent to the ED by default. So my role was to try to actually put in place less of the automation and more actual people there that can actually make decisions. So it's weird that the government in Australia are really still using this automation that has failed so many times. Robo-debt is one example of that, but also there's many others. So I think it's strange that they're kind of doing this. But anyway, basically that's one thing that people are worried about is this is a quite a serious matter in that how is an automated system going to be able to assess whether somebody is eligible for the NDIS? It's very complex. A lot of people's disabilities are extremely complex, and it's very hard to know, unless they are seeing, we do have qualified medical practitioners and allied health professionals for a reason, and that is because they really understand conditions in a way that,
is hard to program into a system. And you can imagine this system just kind of going, okay, can you walk? Okay, yes, can you see, can you do this, can you do that? And then at the end of it, just going, right, okay, you're going to be removed from the scheme. I mean, that is literally the kind of mechanism they were looking at. Okay, maybe they would make it slightly more complex than that, but it was along those lines. It's like, unless you can't walk, can't see, can't do this, can't do that, then you're kind of off the scheme. So, and we don't know what criteria they were going to use, but sort of was panning out to go that way. Luckily, the Greens did manage to get a few things removed. One of those things was around the minister having sort of enormous powers to make decisions that, right now, things like the tribunal make, which is again a process that people can demonstrate eligibility. So I think basically the other thing is, the inefficiencies that I've talked about on the scheme. It's targeting frontline services is something that I think should be a last resort. So the first thing you do when you're trying to sort of save this kind of money is to look at, well, okay, there's a massive bureaucracy behind this. We've seen in like Sweden and Norway and places like that where they do, actually we're not the leaders here, Sweden, Norway, other places, they invest a lot more in disability support. So we're not actually kind of an outlier, given that our wealth in this country is really enormous. We are in the, I know I've got people that understand this stuff better than me, but from what I understand, we're at least in the top 5 or top 10 of wealth in terms of like the median average that, wealth measures, however that's measured. So what do people expect? I mean, ultimately, should we be there, down there with the United States that have a very big mean average, but a pretty small median one? What do we want for this country? We're supposed to be leaders here in supporting disabled people, and yet we're now kind of like looking at going from being not even the lead nation in this provision of supports for disabled people, but actually going right back to a really poor system, really, where there's nothing available. People are going to die. People are going to, there's already been deaths and tragedies. So it's the cost of human lives and the most vulnerable people in society. Fraud is another thing that I know that I need to address. I think this bill did start out talking about fraud, but there's no measures in there at all to tackle fraud, and also the data that's being used around fraud is pretty sketchy, as in, they're using data to exacerbate what they're saying is fraud, and some of it is actually their own system. So where there's a mistake, for example, in a system, or somebody's just made the wrong claim or something, like some of them are, coming from the NDIS themselves, it's just like a data capture of where things are the wrong data. So I've been talking to a lot of people. I've heard from people that have had their plans cut already by 40, 50%. Some of those people I think have been diverted to things like health systems, which are really, really expensive. So I feel like we're just really passing money around, really. We're not really saving anything. So this budget was meant to be about discipline and dignity. So yeah, discipline I can kind of see, dignity not so much.
Mic drop.
Mic drop.
It's perfectly good. Everything's perfectly fine. Thank you so much to Kat John for coming and being our second speaker for tonight, sharing some of the frustrations with this new budget and the questions about whether this is improving the quality of our country, the quality of our communities, and our access to the wealth. Following on from that topic, I think Mark will also be speaking on similar trains. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mark Glasson. Mark joined Anglicare WA in October 2013, and until his appointment as Chief Executive Officer in March 2019, held responsibility for the organisation's service delivery across Western Australia. He has been on the board of Anglicare since 2021. Mark has over 30 years' experience across a range of human services, including service delivery to families and children, community development, public policy, and services to offenders. He holds a Bachelor of Social Work from the University of New South Wales, a graduate diploma in Media Studies from Edith Cowan University, and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. In October 2021, Mark was elected as President of WACOS and is currently the Chair of the No Place for Poverty Steering Committee. Mark was formerly the Chairperson of Shelter WA from 2015 to 2019 and a co-convener of the Home Stretch WA campaign. In May 2026, Mark was recognised as the 2026 Community Award winner as part of the Western Australian of the Year Awards. Mark describes himself, yes, round of applause. Thank you for the cue. Mark describes himself as a committed collaborator striving to find new solutions to old problems. Let's welcome Mark.
Good evening, and thank you for
It's not working.
It's not working. You need to sing again.
There's another microphone just by your lectures.
Oh, no. It's got a little switch.
There you go. I was much better with butcher's paper. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight, and I hope I don't overlap on what the previous speakers have said. But talking about the federal budget, we at Anglicare WA and in some of those other roles that were outlined in my bio, we have advocated for changes to capital gains and negative gearing almost from the day that they were introduced. You can draw a line from the introduction of the capital gains discount in 1999 to a direct line to the disaster that we have in our housing system right now. So it didn't take long. For those of us who were around at that time, there was argument about it was going to create disaster. But John Howard had a different view. His view was informed by the fact that no one ever complained about the value of their house going up. And what happened in the budget was actually the impact of everyone's house price going up and fewer people being able to join the housing market. And so when we look at the changes in the budget, we back them in wholeheartedly. We think that they are the biggest move to reintroduce some degree of equity into our community that we've seen in a generation. So we're there. We think it's a good thing. What we do know is that until somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks before the budget was brought down, they weren't in there. And it was polling that led government to make the decision. The plan was to take those policy recommendations to the next election. And they never would have got over the line. So I think we've been at a really fortunate point in time where something scared the horses and we got a genuine social policy reform as a result of that change. And that's good. But like everything, there is two sides to every story. And we still have massive inequality in Australia. We have massive levels of poverty and homelessness and housing insecurity. And these changes alone will not address that. We have to have a bigger discussion about fairness and what that means and how we want to deal with that in Australia. So we need to acknowledge the government's contribution, and we have, but we need to now point them to things like income support, further tax reform, royalty reform, so that we can actually take some advantage of the wealth. Now, Kat talked about our wealth. The report I think you might be talking about is the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report. Australia is in top 3 of median income permanently.
Wow.
Now, when you think about the wealth of this nation is generated right here. Well, I'm sure this pub is successful, but I mean in Western Australia. So our wealth is driven the national wealth is driven out of Western Australia. And we've got some really significant problems here. So while we back in the Commonwealth Government's budget, I would also say that there's a strong role for the state government, and they have risen to that challenge. They've invested more than $10 billion in housing construction in Western Australia, but our proportion of social housing continues to go backwards. Okay, so since 2015, the number of social houses in Western Australia has gone from 4.2% of all housing to 3.6%. And so what we're doing is we're not keeping up. Over the same period of time, the number of people living in poverty has gone from 211 to 436,000. So we have, and interestingly, they have been the best of times. The economic performance in Western Australia could not have been stronger over those 10 years. So what do we need to do about it? Well, we think that this is the first step for the Commonwealth Government, and they need to recommit to increasing funding for homelessness services, because what you'll find is all our crisis services are full because there's nowhere for people to move out to. We, at Anglicare WA, we operate many accommodation facilities for young people, one just down the road in Spearwood here. We also provide women's refuges and safe services for women who are escaping from violence. What we know is that the crisis system has choked. And so it's really hard for people to get in. We have increasing numbers of women and children living in unsafe houses because there's nowhere for them to go. So whilst the context that I suppose I'm providing is that the benefit that comes from tax reform is something that we should celebrate, but it's not something that we can put a queue in the rack. It's the first step of many. We need to commit to building more social housing. We need to get to 6% of housing stock, and ideally we will need to get to 10%. If you look at some of the more progressive nations around the world, community housing makes up 20-25% of all housing stock. That isn't the case here, of course. We need to continue supporting people to pay rent. Now, the story with rental in Western Australia, the average rental is $747 a week. Okay, the mean rent in Western Australia. We did that research in March, so 747. To be able to make that affordable, you need to earn $129,000 a year, and if you earn that much money, you will pay 30% of your income in rent, and that's where affordable rests, 30% or below. The problem we've got is if we have the lowest income eligibility limit for social housing in the country, so we have $28,000 a year is the maximum amount you're allowed to earn before you lose your social house. Now, when we put these two figures together, what we see is we have a situation where there's a $101,000 income gap between affordability in social housing and affordability in the private rental market. And quite frankly, no one's got that kind of cash, or no one that we deal with, and no one who's looking for affordable housing. In the last 4 years, if you were living in a median rental affordably 4 years ago, in 22, you would need to be finding another $20,000 to have the same level of affordability. Now, that's $20,000 per year. So what are we going to do? So we need to get back to the idea of a social safety net. The creation of the welfare state was, Australia was a leader in that work, and our social safety net has failed us now. We need to increase the levels of Jobseeker and minimum income. When we did our rental affordability snapshot this year, we found that there were 128 properties across the state available on the day we did the survey that were available at an affordable level for people on the minimum income. There were 13 for people across the state for people who were on some form of income support. Now, clearly, we have a big problem with our housing system, and we have a big problem with poverty in Western Australia. So our argument, our position would be that the budget was a great start, but it didn't do the things it really needed to do for the people most in need. And our argument is that whether you're currently in social housing or on Jobseeker or just doing it tough, we would all benefit from those supports. The economy is stronger. What we learned during the pandemic is that demand for our services. So at Anglicare WA, we provide 101 different services across the state. What we found when people had a livable income, when the coronavirus supplement doubled people's income, demand for our services more than halved. So what we know is when people have what they need to survive, they're fully capable of surviving and they go well. So thank you.
Great job.
Thank you to Mark, especially for opening up with a very positive tone about this budget and the things that it might be able to do for us as a country in terms of providing equity and equality, and then also some of the more factual problems with where we still are at the moment with a lot of data about the places we can be going. So if you have some questions there for Mark, you're welcome to be asking them after the break. So we're going to be having a 10-minute break. 10-minute break, time to grab yourself a drink, head to the bathroom if you need, have a chat, and we'll have all three speakers back up for people in the room to ask some questions. Big round of applause one more time for the three speakers.